All right, everybody, we got a lot to get to in this hour, so we're going to cut right to it. My name is Paul Komsic. I'm from Ghost Brewing Company out on Long Island. I represent Long Island for the New York State Brewers Association on RC, and I'm also the chair of the Safety and Technical Committee. So when it comes down to like the low and ABV alcohol beers, safety is definitely a concern as far as like doing it right. So let's get right to it. Nathan is from and currently lives in North Carolina. He earned his bachelor's in biology from East Carolina University. After a couple of years in crop protection, he went back to school for his doctorate in biochemistry from the Ohio State University. He was a scientist for Novozymes, developing enzyme and yeast products for biofuels, distilling, and brewing, before venturing into technical sales and business development for brewing and distilling, as well as other biotech industries. He is now an East U.S. sales manager for Berkeley Yeast, specializing in premium engineered yeast for breweries. Nathan, everybody.
Thank you, Paul. Okay. Yes, as Paul mentioned, my name is Nathan Kreel, and what I'm going to talk to you about are best practices for producing low and non-alcoholic beer. There is a lot of slides, so please bear with me. I may be speedy, and I would ask if we could save questions till the end. With that, let me get started, and I will ask Paul to hand out samples. You can try them now, but I will be talking about these as we get further along in the talk. So why are we interested in low and non-alc beer? Just a brief outline. I'm going to go over that, give you a snapshot of current trends, and then also go over some options of what you can do, either current or things that you may need to consider purchasing if you'd like to take this venture in producing low and non-alc beers. And then get into what you need to consider when you're designing a recipe, followed by what you need to be aware of when it comes to packaging your product. And that's mainly pertaining to the safety, as Paul alluded to, of reducing pathogenic contamination. From here on out, just for the sake of saving words, I'm going to say non-alc most of the time, but I'm going to be referring to both low and non-alc, however we say it. It just rolls off my tongue to say non-alc. So, why are we interested in this? A survey in 2023, in January of 2023, indicated that a third of Americans have a desire to consume less alcohol. And that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be younger generation choosing to consume less alcohol. Could be COVID hangover that we're talking about. Hey, I gotta stop drinking so much. We all say that all the time, don't we? But also could be California sober. Could be the economy as a whole. But nonetheless, it is real. People have a desire to consume less alcohol. And with that shows in the sales of alcoholic beverages compared to non-alc. So an article put out by the Wall Street Journal indicated that the growth of alcohol sales is stagnant at about 3% in 2023, whereas non-alc, the growth of non-alc is growing tenfold at 32%. Now that's still a small piece of the beverage market, beer market at about 1% to 2%. However, it can't be overlooked how much it is growing. In a separate survey, participants were asked, what do they miss most when they are consuming a non-alc beverage? And this was a select all that apply. So if you add up the numbers on the left-hand side, that adds up to 140%. So no, we did not create people out of thin air. But number one, the mood-enhancing effect. You have a non-alc beer in your hand. You know that there's no alcohol. You know what the effect is going to be when you're done consuming that beverage. So the participants' responses were overwhelming. That the mood-enhancing effect, the euphoric effect when you consume alcohol. The goal is, it used to be maybe when we were younger, partying, college. I want to get drunk. No, it's now. Hey, I know when I'm drinking an alcoholic beverage, I might get a little more relaxed, get in the mood, that's missing. Number 2 and 3, the flavor and variety of choice. And I've highlighted these here because this is what you can control. So this is why we're here today. But something else you need to control is pathogenic contamination. And this is going to be the ongoing theme throughout this talk. A great cartoon in this paper written in 2009, a gentleman out of a university in Australia, has this cartoon in here that well describes what it is that you do when you brew beer. You're giving bacteria all these hurdles that they have to get through in order to survive. Boil, hop addition, pH levels, ethanol, CO2 that displaces oxygen, so obligate aerobes are not able to thrive. You do all these when you make a full alc beverage. And in doing so, when you're making a traditional full strength beer, the likelihood of incidents with pathogens are close to nil. So to date, this author had indicated that full alc beer, there were no documented incidences with pathogens. However, when you reduce that alcohol and pH and residual sugars are altered as well, you increase the likelihood for pathogenic contamination. And in a low alc beer, there have been documented incidences with E. coli, and this is O157H7, Salmonella, Shigella, Clostridium, B. cereus, so on and so forth. So the contamination risk increases as you lower that alcohol. And in non-alc beer, there is a very, very high risk, and incidences are likely to occur. Back on that cartoon, and you'll see my joke later, I like to consider that the gauntlet. So when you venture into making a non-alc beer, this is a gauntlet. Don't let bacteria survive that gauntlet. And the microbial risk is shown. Same author, article a couple years later, 2011. In a non-alc beer, what do you have? Again, no alcohol. So there's no growth and inhibition for ethanol to deteriorate cell walls. Higher pH. If you are not fermenting, if the yeasts are not fermenting and making that beer acidic during the fermentation process, that pH does have a likelihood of being higher than a traditional full-strength beer. You can add acid when you make your non-alc beer, but if you're not, you have a higher pH, and that again creates an optimum environment for bacteria to thrive. And third, if you're not fermenting your sugars, you're left over with residual sugars. So these 3 pillars here are exactly what yeast could be wild yeast, but bacteria need to survive. And in this, if you don't take this away in your non-alc beverage production, then you risk bacterial contamination. So the author performed challenge studies in a beer, and it was the same beer but with altered ethanol and pH environments. On the left-hand side, the beer was pH 4.3, and only the alcohol was altered. So levels of 5% ABV, 2.7%, and 0.5%, and a dose of E. coli O157H7 was dosed in, and then measurements were taken over a number of days, survival rates. And what I'd like to point out is that even after 15 days at pH 4.3 and 5% or 2.7% alcohol, the E. coli was able to survive. It wasn't until after 15 days that the low alc beer, the growth rate began exponentially in a 0.5% alcohol, 0.5% ABV beverage, non-alc beer. On the right-hand side, this time the alcohol was constant at 0.5%, and the pH was altered, pH 5.0, 4.5, 4.3, and 4. And as the as the product became more acidic, the E. coli was less likely to survive in that 0.5% ABV non-alc beer. But as the pH rose, you can see that the fastest growth rate was in the pH 5. The author also did the same studies in salmonella, and the same results occurred. So in this article, E. coli and salmonella are presented, but I only showed E. coli for the sake of saving time and space in the presentation. So as you approach to make your non-alc beverage, 3 things to consider in package and stabilization. Number 1, you need to drop the pH. You do have to be below a 4.6 to be a packaged food product. So we recommend to go as low as 4.0 or as low as your sensory can tolerate. Need to pasteurize. Tunnel pasteurization is, in our opinion, the most robust and safest method, along with acidification, to have a shelf-stable and safe product. So if you decide to produce a non-alc beverage, first and foremost, try to source means for tunnel pasteurization. And lastly, this is questioned and a bit back and forth, but please don't put it on tap. You have no way of controlling contamination from the surface connection between the coupler and your keg, as well as your beer line, as well as your faucet. So recommendation, please consider only canning and bottling. This is also supported by the Brewers Association article that came out in mid-January, if you read this. So there's a number of approaches you can take in producing a non-alc beverage. And I'll go through this. Hopefully I don't get stuck too long on this, so bear with me. I'll try to group it together as best I can to get through it. The first 2 are physical separations. The first one is a thermal method, thermal or evaporative method. You're going to make a full-strength beer. So you're going to have your same method throughout your brewery process, making your beer. However, when it comes to your removal process, you're going to be heating it or using a rectifier to remove any volatiles in the form of ethanol. The upside to it is this is a way that you can make a full-strength 0.0 non-alcoholic beer, and you'll complete a fermentation. The challenge to this is that you would create flavor degradation through the heating process. It would require high energy costs by the heat, as well as a high capital expenditure of buying basically a still. So now you're going to have to expand and buy a still, as well as considerations of any distiller's permit through the state, federal government, and possibly even taxes for that. The second option you have that's a physical separation is reverse osmosis or membrane filtration. This is a little more gentle than using a thermal or evaporative method, but it's still physical separation. You're passing product through. You're separating through filtration. I'll simplify with that. It can be more gentle. That's the upside. Again, you'll be completing your fermentation, so you'll make a full-strength beer and then separating that way. So that's a benefit. But the downside, much like the thermal evaporative method, is you can still end up with flavor loss. Again, high energy cost. You may need to input a lot of water to replace any ethanol that you've removed, so maintain your volume. And much like the other process, there'll be capital required in order to buy that filtration equipment. The third one is considering arrested or cold contact or limited fermentation is another way of putting it. In this, you would change your mash and lautering process. You'd have a shorter contact time, have a lower RDF, a lower Plato. And with that, you would still use a traditional yeast in making your beer. And but it would be a much shorter fermentation. The cost of this is low capital because, well, you already have your brewery. You just need to reconsider how you're going to work your process. There'd be low flavor degradation and low to no need for alcohol removal if you're able to hit your target. The downside is you could hit your target. You could overshoot, you could over-ferment, and with that, there would be a need to have to water back. If you water back, then you would be degrading your flavors that you'd be producing in your fermentation, which would maybe be undesirable. There could be warty off flavors because you have an incomplete fermentation, but at the same time, not only would you have warty off flavors, you would also have residual sugars and lack fermentation character because you're having a shorter fermentation. And the last but not least is the option to use a low or non-alc yeast. We've seen and heard many of these becoming available on the market. We at Berkeley Yeast do have one coming out, and this is what you have if you haven't tasted it already, is one of our non-alc yeasts. I'll talk about it more in a little bit. Feel free to sample it now if you'd like. What these strains are either hybridized or bioengineered to not be able to uptake maltose and maltotriose. So you block that, and there's only limited sugar availability for fermentation. Could be very low. It's a drop-in solution, so again, there's very low capital. You would just have to alter your brewing, your mashing and lautering process, and monitor your fermentations. There would be availability of yeast to make these beer flavors, and again, I'll get to it more in our yeast. There would be no flavor degradation from alcohol removal. Yes.
Sorry, in terms of reverse osmosis removal, using like a normal reverse osmosis machine or a dedicated, in terms of that, like how do you run the beer through that?
It wouldn't be a normal reverse osmosis. You would be collecting off ethanol in a side stream. Yeah, and if you don't, I would love to. I'll talk to you more about it after the talk, if you don't mind. Moving on, one of the challenges though with non-alc yeast is much like the arrested fermentation option. You would still could be producing warty off flavors, have residual sugars remaining, and again lack that fermentation character. So, however, a non-alc yeast would be the easiest place to start, and this would be in your experimentation. As I mentioned, a non-alc yeast, the maltose and maltotriose pathways are blocked, so anything that is produced in the mash and lautering process is unallowed by the yeast to be taken up. However, glucose could still be consumed, so a small amount of ethanol would be produced, but hopefully that this would be below the levels to be able to categorize your product as non-alc. It'd be, again, low capital expenditure, and for some of these yeasts, they're very highly precise. The one thing, again, to produce a low ABV, as I mentioned before, you would start with a lower Plato. We have here Plato about 6, but it could be in a range of 5 to 8, depending on your RDF. The unfermented maltose and maltotriose could have some body addition, could lend some body, and then have negligible sweetness. And the one nice thing about this is that it could be applied across all breweries. So it would be easily implemented and could be a simplified process. And the right-hand side is just an indication that the attenuation is far lower in a non-alc yeast. So whereas when you're brewing a traditional full-strength beer, you're looking at attenuations, 70, 75%, whereas in these maltose negative strains, they are far lower, between 10 and 25%. So going back to the survey that indicated what consumers missed most in a non-alc beverage, flavor and variety of choice. And again, these are what I presented just now were options for how to get started, but this is where you have the control to be able to say, okay, I'm going to take this approach. This is what I have at my disposal. Now I'm going to consider making a beer, making a non-alc beer, and you have all these levers that you can pull, all these available products out there in order to do this. So where to get started? Some recipe targets, and this is going to take a lot of trial and error, lots of opportunity for experimentation. But what we first recommend is to perform a process review, walk around your brewery, find out what tanks you have, where you can limit your touches, potential for contamination, do some tests, identify where, if anything, corners, 90-degree bends, things like that. And when you set up how you're going to brew this non-alc, you want to minimize your movement around the brewery. Try to have one hose, not a connection of hoses. Minimize your use of pumps. And then also try to minimize the tank transfer and long distances across a brewery, if at all possible. For recipe design, we recommend starting with a simple grist, a 2-row, something that is foam positive. Try to avoid crystal malt that would lend oxidative character. And then for now, don't worry about the color. So don't worry about a high roasted malt. Just start simple, just get your feet wet, understand the process, and then worry about color additions. And I'll have some examples for things to consider when you're in your bright tank for adjusting your color. When you're targeting your Play-Doh, as I mentioned, target low, 6 degrees, a range between 5 and 8. But with that, ask yourself, do you want, what degree of fermentation would you like? 10 to 25%, and that's dictated by, if you have a lower gravity, that allows you to have a little bit higher RDF and vice versa. When you're walking around your brewery performing a process review, take a look at your lauter ton. If you are a brewery that has a wide lauter ton and you're going to start using far less malt to obtain this lower Play-Doh, you may have a wider bed. If you have a wide bed and you need to increase the mass, consider using rice hulls in order to cover the bed as well as increase mass for efficient lautering. Lastly, your hop considerations. Brew house hops, hot side hops are true to form, but again, because you're having a watered down or less Play-Doh in your product, you may want to consider backing off your BUs. And there's pros and cons when using, there's pros and cons when approaching your RDF. If you're using a non-alc yeast or arrested fermentation and you're going to have a low degree of fermentation, around 10%, that benefits you to producing low alcohol. However, with that, the downside to this is you would have more residual sugars, and as mentioned before, you may not be producing some of those beer determinants, isoamyl acetate, other esters. And your beer would remain worty. The upside to this is because you won't be producing as much alcohol in this fermentation, there would be no dilution or dealcoholization required. But the further higher you go with a RDF around 25%, yes, you would be producing higher alcohol. So as mentioned, this is if you're using a limited fermentation, you may overshoot your targets, so you would have to you would produce higher alcohol, and you may have to dilute. The upside is you do lower that residual sugar, and that residual sugar you're concerned with because it becomes food for bacterial contamination. The flip side, increased beeriness. So you would be able to allow for the yeast to produce some more of those beer characteristics in your product. However, as mentioned, dilution or dealcoholization is required. One thing I didn't put in here is that the cost of having to add water, and then also the risk of having to add water. You increase that risk. You're touching it, as mentioned in the previous slide. You could introduce bacterial contamination. And with that, you would have a diluted watery product, so almost making hop water. I'm sure we're all well aware of this, but this is just to give you a brief overview and remind you that in your mashing process, when you go to steep your grains, you're activating your strike water at your certain temperature and pH. You're activating the malt enzymes, and those malt enzymes are going to be your determinants for your production of your maltose, maltotriose, glucose, longer chain dextrins. So just briefly here, alpha amylase is going to hydrolyze your starch from the starch to long chain dextrins at random cuts. Beta amylase is going to hydrolyze maltose at the reducing ends, and alpha glucosidase will produce glucose molecules from the non-reducing ends. Pilolinase, even though it's pictured here, I'm not going to touch because in malt it's inactivated at a very low temperature. So by the time you strike, it's inactivated. And the reason I bring this up is because when you're targeting a mash temp, time and temp, when you want to target a low RDF in your low Plato product, in your low Plato grist, the degree of fermentation is going to be time and temperature dependent. So by decreasing the time and or increasing the temperature, that will dictate your RDF. So we've done trials where we had just some examples. So I can't tell you the exact RDF that was obtained, but some examples of this is mashing it at 155 for only 10 minutes and then ramping up immediately to 175 for sparge. Another example of this is 165, and the second that it touches the water, you're already ramping up. So this I highlight here to obtain that low RDF in a low Plato, whereas you're used to sparging in for 45, 60 minutes, maybe even higher or longer at a temperature around 160. You have to change your mindset that this is going to be a quick touch because you're just producing a little bit of glucose, some maltose that won't be consumed, and you just want to quickly move to your boil. Another thing to consider is the acidity. So you can utilize acid in this process, and doing that, you'd be able to control some of this activity and have, and with the addition of acids, you would have less tannic runoff. So you want to consider maybe adjusting the pH in that initial strike to avoid the tannic runoff. It would reduce your bitterness units, but there could be an upside that would add some fermentation character. And too low of a pH would affect your RDF by affecting those enzymes, primarily the alpha and beta amylases, as is indicated by the chart here. So you want to mash in a range between 5.1, 5.5 in order to get those activities. These next few slides are just going to be lists as such. So there's no right and wrong. It's going to be a lot of reading, but also a lot of considerations. So The previous slides were about what you want to consider when you're mashing and lautering, and now when you move into your kettle, you want to consider how you're going to use your hops for flavor and bitterness. As mentioned before, these would have similar flavor and aroma characteristics, much like making a traditional full-strength beer, but because it's a lower Plato, you want to consider decreasing your BUs so it's not overly bitter and it doesn't overpower. Later additions can maximize the bitterness units, and then you don't have to use hops. You can consider other products that would contribute to bitterness, like Hopsteiner Salvo. For mouthfeel and sweetness, your unfermentable sugars, you could consider adding maltodextrin. That would increase mouthfeel or sweetness. There's other products like Fibersol, a beta-glucan, that would create that mouthfeel. Another thing I failed to mention in the previous slide, now that I am mentioning Fibersol, don't be afraid to consider using adjuncts like oats or wheat for mouthfeel as well. And acidity addition here, that won't impact your RDF because you've already passed that stage in the mash. In the fermenter, so your cold side, this is where contamination and sanitation become super critical. In your fermenter, your yeast, so your yeast considerations, you want to consider the phenolics produced, or if you want it to be neutral or have other flavor additions. Depending on the yeast, you want to make sure that you're utilizing that yeast under its optimal condition, be it traditional yeast in a limited or arrested fermentation, or using a non-alc yeast. Some non-alc strains can be utilized like full alc brewing strains. And I'll give an example of Berkeley yeast. We have a Chico background strain that is maltotriose negative, and we manufacture it, propagate it up, and then deliver it as a cream yeast. So we don't have a dry yeast yet, but we're considering it, much like others. But you could use it as you would a yeast pitch that you get for any other product, any other full strength beer that you would produce. Hops here, this is a bit contentious. You want to use less hops for less time. Consider adding them cold. Consider different means of using the hops. Maybe making a hop tea and adding that to the fermenter. Consider other hop products. But here, if you're utilizing cones, especially adding a hop cone, if they're coming in fresh, there could be E. coli. There could be more than E. coli on there. So the farmer can't control what happens in the field. This right here, and when we ran trials with a little bit of dry hopping and did a chloroform test, and it was through the roof. So, this is where tunnel pasteurization comes into play. Other things to consider. When you're fermenting, you want to try to keep it cold, again, to minimize your ability, minimize bacteria ability to grow. But if you need to warm, consider using ALDC. And why do you warm in a fermenter? You warm in a fermenter to do a diacetyl rest. If you use ALDC, you may be able to avoid that need to warm up your fermenter and do this instead. Here you could add preservatives, potassium sorbate, sodium benzoate, Kyber, but got to understand whether these are contributing to bacterial static status or bactericidal. Also need to investigate whether you need to label. And then, again, if you haven't noticed, an ongoing theme, not a central theme, but an ongoing theme is the acid additions that can help with safety. So acidifying, but also there could be some acid additions here that could lend some flavor. Citric or malic acid is a good example. One tip I'd like to point out, in making a non-alc product, you're going to have a diluted product, so less alcohol, that if you are going to use a glycol chiller of the fermenter, to keep it above 34, because if you let it drop, any condensation on the side will create ice and you'll freeze the inside of your tank. So that's a pro tip.
And your racking arm as well, speaking from experience.
All right. Didn't consider that.
Yeah, you can't spin it.
But as I mentioned at the beginning of the last slide, on the cold side, now you get into a critical stage where if your fermenter is too warm, you do risk bacterial growth if there is contamination. We call this entering the danger zone. I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of Kenny Loggins here. We did at first. We did. We were going to put a picture of him up or cue the music, but hey, bacteria thrive around 70 Fahrenheit. And again, if you have an abundance of residual sugars and little to no alcohol present, and if your pH, as the article indicated with the challenge studies at pH 4.3 even, you will have bacterial growth. So we recommend decreasing the risk with 3 Ds, decrease the quantity of additions and touches, thereby decreasing any potential microbial load, decrease contact time with your hops, especially if they're cones, and then decrease time in this danger zone and keep it as cool as possible. In the bright tank, this is where you could consider utilizing color additives. There's some good products out there. Pure Malt and Cinnamar are one of them. They are beer that are just evaporated down to a syrup. So those could be things to use if you wanted to add a little more color. X-Berry is a non-beer, has natural ingredients that could be used. Flavors, I'll cover flavors and mouthfeel, the next 2 columns together, because as you can see here, many of these do contain a lot of sugars, a lot of fermentable sugars. So utilize these if needed. But if you utilize these, consider adding them, and this gets to the pro tip down at the bottom. Add the fermentables cold and do it right before pasteurization. So you will minimize any bacterial growth if you utilize these products. Put it in the bright tank, mix, right to packaging and pasteurization. And lastly, consider going as high as you can with carbonation. So 2 things to consider here is, with a lack of alcohol, carbonation can do a good job of creating that mouthfeel, that pleasant consumption, and can be a good replacement if there's no alcohol present. But what you need to consider is how the gas will react in the given product when you go to pasteurize. So again, this can be a lot of trial and error, and but try to go as high as you can. Okay, so one of the things that we did with our non-alc yeast is, and actually let me start over here. Again, what you're trying to do is create a non-alc beverage. You're trying to make it as pleasant for the consumer and as beer-like as possible. You can do that a myriad of ways that I showed in the previous slides, and I hope you guys wrote every single one of those words down. Yeah? Yeah. But one of the things you can do, non-alc yeast, this is what we did, and these are the 2 samples that have been passed around. We ran a trial. We ran a trial at a brewery in California, and tested a production, same beer, with a traditional yeast, and then compared it to 3 candidates of non-alc yeast. And one non-alc yeast was simply a maltose negative, maltotriose negative uptake strain, and then also had a non-alc strain of the same kind that produced hoppy character, so it produced terpenes, and then another one that produced tropical flavors, so it was thiol releasing. And what you can see here is that we were successful with the two samples that you have. The first sample you have is the second non-alcoholic beer, the non-alc that produces the hoppy notes. So with the tasting panel, it was overwhelming that it was a more favorable beer compared to the traditional full-strength beer. And then the second sample you have is the one that produced the tropical notes. So that was the goal that we were getting at, that was shown here, and this is what you're sampling. So cheers and enjoy it. Okay, so your first batch, you spent a lot of time walking around your brewery. You've considered all of these different options. Your first batch, first do nothing and ask yourself, how did it go? Fail small. So brew in a 5-barrel batch, smaller if you can, fail, and be prepared to toss. But before you do that, pull samples and try to understand what can you do out of all those steps, out of all those suggestions. Acidification, sugar additive, or product additive. I shouldn't be saying add more sugar, but different considerations. Taste, tinker, chef it up. Okay, and then prepare yourself for the next approach. After you've done that, then, as mentioned, carbonate it, package it, and see how it is stable in a tunnel pasteurization. So you can do this in a warm water bath, heat it up to 60, 66 degrees Celsius, and let it sit, target 100 PUs, and then test and see how that goes. Wash, rinse, repeat. As mentioned before, this was the joke from the cartoon, by the way. Don't let pathogens survive the gauntlet. So general recommendations. I can't stress this enough. Be aware and review your process. There are process authorities you can hire, third-party extension services, universities. I have a link on my last slide that is for the FDIO, AFDO, excuse me, AFDO. You can just put in New York, a list comes up. I was able to find 6 process authorities. From my understanding, it's not an exhaustive list, so it's not updated, but it's a good place to start. There was a podcast on the MBAA a couple weeks ago from Cornell University Food Science. Reach out to them. They would probably direct you in the right direction for process authorities. So be aware and review. Use good manufacturing process. Excuse me. Take a sip of water here, or maybe I should just take a sip of non-alc. Oh, sweet, even better. All right. Damn, that's good. Use good manufacturing processes. So the Code of Federal Regulations, this section here, Title 21, Chapter 1, Subchapter B, Part 117. It is pages upon pages of considerations for one, producing a food product, canning, and testing. I've mentioned this before. As you go through your process review, test for microbial contaminations throughout the process. You want to be looking for E. coli and Salmonella. Those are going to be gram negative. They're going to be able to survive harsh conditions and even hop additions, but still be aware of others, Staph aureus, Clostridium, B. cereus, I don't have listed here. Just be aware. And then, can't stress this enough, consider tunnel pasteurization. If you're able to reach out to a co-packer or another facility that has access to a tunnel pasteurizer, consider utilizing this. And at the same time, acidify as close to pH 4 as I mentioned before. Ideally, you would want to do both of these because it's an additive effect, greater than additive. Some microorganisms are able to survive these harsh conditions. And then if you do other things, are your methods bacteriostatic or bactericidal? So we of course want bactericidal, flash pasteurization, preservatives, as I mentioned, but these combinations still continue to be tested. So that's why I stress acidification and tunnel pasteurization is the most robust. And why? We don't want to let history repeat itself. We'll leave that up to the politicians. The CDC estimates over 100,000 hospitalizations and 3,000 deaths occur every year due to foodborne illnesses. Now, yes, most of these are in fresh packages, meat, leafy greens. It's what we hear on the news all the time, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen in a can or bottle. And just 2 points, if you all are aware, in the 90s, there was an E. coli outbreak from unpasteurized apple juice in Odwalla products. They were picking up apples off the ground at food stands, pressing, and they said they were washing, pressing, and packaging, and there was an E. coli outbreak that led to a death and 65 illnesses. And in World War I and II, production of wheat beer, so it was around 2.5% ABV, but had a higher pH. There was an E. coli strain. It wasn't identified, but likely O157H7 outbreak there made troops sick. When you're testing, consider plate tests. So there's a number of resources there. AOAC certified tests, and then sourcing. There are many places you can source plates and methods. I show here on the right-hand side that, do you need to consider diluting in order to get an accurate plate count, or pulling a sample and concentrating through a filter and then plating that? So how you go about your testing. PCR test is another option. You can get PCR tests that are specific for certain pathogens. Or as a third option, you can have an outside party come in, test for you, or you can collect tests and send them out. There's a number of testing services and third-party contractors. Again, reach out to University Extension Services to do so. Okay, I look down at my clock and I see that I have about 10 minutes left, and I'm glad, because I would love to talk to you about tunnel pasteurization. However, this is probably another hour unto itself. Are you guys ready for this? Let me have some of this non-alc beer. I'm just kidding. Tunnel pasteurization, if you're unaware, it's a heat treatment of a product to increase the shelf life and reduce microbial load. That's really it in a nutshell. What you want to do when you pasteurize is take into account your time and temperature hold, your microbial load. So you need to understand your testing in the previous slide. How much do you have? And how much do you need to decrease? Because that plays into your D sub T, which is your decimal reduction time, your Z, which is your change in temperature for reduction of microbial load logarithmically, and your PU, which is a calculation of those values intermingled, plus time and temperature hold. But understand that PU is microbe specific. So I've seen in a lot of literature and other talks that a Z value of, specifically at 6.94, some people just round up to 7. They utilize 7 degrees Celsius as a Z value for determining PU. That's a bad approach because that's only yeast specific. So large breweries that do tunnel pasteurize do that to kill the yeast so there's no secondary fermentation in the packaged product for shelf stability. But if you are producing a non-alc if you're producing a non-alc beer, you have much more than yeast to worry about. So the pathogens. On top of that, the values can change depending on the beer environment. So for instance, I point to this paper here, and you probably can't read it from back here, but a paper by Lanton and Ingledew in the mid-90s investigated the changes of the decimal reduction time and Z values in different beers with different microbial loads of pathogens. And that's what's indicated on the table on the right-hand side, that in a beer versus a full-strength beer versus a non-alc beer, as the alcohol and pH changed, so did the D value that it took to degrade or kill the microbes. On the left-hand side, there's recommendations for targeting PUs when pasteurizing for a non-alc product. You can see here a non-alc beer, anywhere between 80 to 120. That's about 10 times higher than a lager beer, or about 4 times higher than a ale or stout. But we also would recommend going, attempting to go even higher, because this is a risk that you don't want to, you just don't want to let out into the public. I don't know how else to put that. I'm going to make this available to everyone, or contact me afterwards, and I'll send this to you. But a lot of what was in the talk today, links to the FSMA Act, the GMP practice I mentioned, the article from Brewers Association, the AFDO directory for the process authorities that I mentioned, and if anything, the 5 references on the right-hand side, those are fantastic articles, journal articles to read through for discussing, if you're making a non-alc beverage, and how pathogens can grow and survive in your finished product. So everyone, this was a sobering talk, but at least we're near beer. Okay, all right. You all are awake. Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.
Does anybody have any questions?
I did.
Has anyone experimented with using irradiation as opposed to pasteurization to sterilize non-alc beer?
I did not come across anything of that nature. I wouldn't say yes or no to that, but I did not see anything, or I have heard anyone taking that approach.
What's your opinion on using preservatives in non-alc beers like potassium sorbate?
Yeah, it's possible. Potassium sorbate, you need to have a lower pH in order for sodium benzoate and potassium sorbate to be active. But we know that those preservatives are widespread and functioning. But as I mentioned before, you need to consider labeling if you utilize those. Do you want to do that? And also, use them in conjunction with other means of reducing your microbial load, like tunnel pasteurization.
Is there a hard cutoff for how low alcohol you would package something without pasteurization? Is that pH dependent, or is it all kind of a spectrum?
It's a spectrum,
Okay.
but I think a general rule of thumb is when you start to go below 2.6, 2.5, and pH. So to be, it's in the FDA, it's in the guideline federal regulations for how low a pH needs to be for a food product. So it's 4.6 or below. So definitely have that. But once you start to get below 2.5%, I would also strongly consider having even more acidic conditions.
Is there a chart where ABV and pH?
There is not a chart, but again, referencing, I believe it is the Spears paper. Down below, there is a 2-page table 1. Let me say it the other way. Table 1 covers 2 pages of lactobacilli, spoilage, microorganisms, E. coli, salmonella, and the different alcohol pH and the decimal reduction time, the D sub T, and the Z values. So it's very valuable. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So doing your sort of fast touch mash and then controlling pH, do you think that's then enough to use a traditional yeast strain if you had a smaller pitch to get you a lower alcohol beer, or would you still recommend using the low producing strains?
You can still run that process, but I would not consider using a lower pitch of yeast, because if you do that, you could run a longer lag time that does open up for any contamination. So optimizing your yeast pitch, whether traditional or non-alc, I would strongly consider having that well oxygenated and high viability and ready to go. And sorry, before you ask your question, to that, your fermentation is only going to be about 2.5 days in both cases.
Kind of building off his, so if you versus a lower pitch, you just do a grain bill that's more condensed and you're shooting for that lower alcohol content. What will the difference be between that and the Berkeley yeast that only ferments the specific sugars?
Yeah, well, it'd be vastly different. So if you so you're saying if you use a higher pitch of a non-alc yeast compared to a lower pitch of a traditional yeast?
No, so like a smaller grain bill to shoot for that lower alcohol percentage with a regular yeast pitch of, whatever our house yeast is.
Shoot for a low gravity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could any approach you want to take.
But is there a difference between doing that flavor-wise maybe compared to doing the Berkeley or whatever other?
Yes, it could be. Yes. I mean, it's trial and error. I mean, I can't.
That's nothing you guys have tested or anything?
Running trials, yeah, we used identical mash and starting Play-Doh with a traditional yeast versus our non-alc. And that was the slide with the sensory panel. But there was no no dilution. It was just, we just finished it out. We did have limited fermentation on the traditional beer. So we tried to target the same alcohol percentage. So there may, I'll have to go back and look. There may have been dilution if it overshot, so that we were targeting 0.5% to give it an even sensory analysis.
Is there a watering when you were showing like the strike temperature and then I know you said that you jumping up to 175 with your sparge and you said it was 0 time in between. Is there no watering in between that and you're mashing in and then you're just starting to sparge at a higher temperature and
Yeah. I mean, you want to minimize that contact time, whether in the sparge or lauter, to as low as possible. And again, it's going to be a trial and error of when you strike. If you're going to target that higher temperature for 0 time, you need to take into consideration the lautering that's involved in that as well.
Any other questions?
Is pasteurization recommended for fully alcoholic beers too in cans?
No, because you have high alcohol, you have low pH, and you have very little residual sugars. Yeast have worked during the fermentation to outcompete pathogenic contaminations. I'm not going to say yes or no to that.
If you're back sweetening stuff.
But who here has made a full strength beer, not pasteurized, and have had a customer get sick?
Not for the beer.
How many beers did they have?
If I could just touch 1 second on the foodborne illness stuff. I came from a culinary background. I was in kitchens for over 15 years. Suffolk County out on Long Island, we have the strictest board of health in the entire country. If your food truck is registered in Suffolk County, you can go anywhere else in the country and you don't need to register with their board of health. You're good to go. The foodborne illness stuff it's real. E. coli will kill you, and not just if you're elderly or high risk or anything like that. Same thing with the salmonella and the Clostridium. Was it the third one?
Botulinum.
Yeah. And I have a very, very good friend of mine who lost their niece to E. coli. And one of the things with E. coli in this country is doctors don't deal with it on a regular basis. So a lot of times when they're finding it and dealing with it, they think it's something else. And by the time they realize it's E. coli, it's already too late. And my friend lost her niece. The last memories of her niece that she has is her screaming on the operating table before she passed away. So E. coli and the foodborne illness stuff, it's real stuff, and I doubt anybody wants any of that associated with their brewery or their brand name. So keep that in check. This is a hot trend. Everybody wants to get on it, but we really have to do this right. Beer, it's kind of, with the alcohol, it's a little bit magical. We get away with a lot, but the NA stuff, you really have to be on board with it. But
Well put. I'm sorry I didn't mention that earlier, but this is a burgeoning topic. It's in your hands. So everyone wants to be involved in this. Let's do it right.
excellent. All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you.